They say when you finally tune in, everything changes. Not just your thoughts, not just your surroundings, but your entire reality. Have you ever felt like the universe was whispering something to you, but you couldn't hear it because the noise of the world was too loud? That whisper is the frequency of God. And the moment you begin to silence your doubts, tune out the chaos, and truly align yourself with that divine signal, life starts to unfold in miraculous ways. Most people are living their entire lives tuned into the wrong station, absorbing fear, comparison, doubt, anger, and confusion like it's normal. They're picking up static from the world and wondering why they feel lost. But when you make the conscious decision to switch your frequency, to elevate, to connect, to truly seek alignment with the divine, everything starts to move. Not outwardly at first, but inwardly, deep in the core of your being. A quiet shift begins. A calmness replaces panic. A deep sense of knowing begins to take root. You start to feel a divine presence guiding your steps even when you're unsure where they lead. You stop chasing peace outside and begin discovering it within. That's when you know you're beginning to match the frequency of God. There's a certain resonance to faith, a vibration, a pulse. It's not loud, it's not showy, it doesn't demand attention. But once you align with it, you can't unfeel it. You begin to make decisions differently. You walk slower but more intentionally. You speak less but with more depth. You don't engage in every battle or entertain every distraction. The things that once used to steal your energy start to feel irrelevant, not because the problems disappeared, but because your awareness evolved. You're no longer living in reaction mode. You're living in alignment. When God becomes the frequency your soul tunes into, your whole inner world starts to synchronize with a higher pattern. Your days begin to feel purposeful, even when you don't understand the full plan. You begin to trust that there's a reason for every delay, every detour, every disappointment. What used to frustrate you now begins to feel like redirection. You stop forcing doors to open, and instead, you learn to wait for what flows. Because in divine timing, nothing is ever too early or too late. This frequency doesn't just change how you see the world, it changes what the world reflects back to you. You start to attract situations that match your new vibration. People who bring peace rather than chaos. Opportunities that align with your values, not just your ambitions. You begin to experience less resistance and more flow. Even in tough times, there's a strange sense of stability inside you, like you're anchored in something eternal, untouched by the storms outside. That's not coincidence, that's divine frequency. You start recognizing God not just in the big blessings, but in the ordinary moments. A stranger's smile, a song that touches your soul, a message at the perfect time, a sunset that feels like a personal gift from the heavens. Your gratitude deepens, your awareness expands. You feel alive in a way that's hard to explain, but impossible to ignore. And yet, the journey isn't without its challenges. Tuning into God's frequency often requires a kind of dying, not physical, but spiritual. The death of ego, the surrender of control, the letting go of old stories that no longer serve you. It's a process of purification, painful at times, but necessary. You'll start to feel disconnected from people you once felt close to, not out of judgment, but out of evolution. You're not better than them, just vibrating differently now. You'll be called to face yourself, to confront your fears, to peel back the layers of illusion you've wrapped around your identity. This part is uncomfortable, but it's also sacred, because every time you shed a false layer, you come closer to your true essence. Every time you let go of a toxic belief, you open yourself to divine truth. It's in this shedding that your spirit begins to shine. The more you align, the less you feel the need to prove anything. You stop hustling for validation. You stop seeking applause. You realize that the only real approval that matters is from the one who created you. And with that realization comes a deep, almost unshakable peace. You begin to move through life with a quiet confidence, a kind of serenity that can't be faked. It's not that you don't face problems anymore. It's that your response changes. You pray before you panic. You reflect before you react. You trust before you fear. That's the power of divine frequency. It doesn't exempt you from life's challenges, but it equips you with a divine resilience that carries you through them. It's in this space of alignment that your creativity flourishes. Ideas come to you effortlessly. Solutions appear in moments of stillness. You begin to sense when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to hold on and when to let go. Your intuition sharpens, not because you're suddenly magical, but because you're finally listening. The voice of God isn't always a loud thunder, it's often a soft nudge, a whisper in your heart, a sense that can't be explained but can always be trusted. Matching God's frequency means creating space to hear that voice. It means shutting out the noise long enough to tune into the signal. And once you hear it, you'll realize it was there all along. You just needed to silence the static. You start to become magnetic, not in a superficial way, but in an energetic way. People are drawn to your peace, your clarity, your depth. They sense something different in you. They can't always name it, but they feel it. That's the light of alignment. It doesn't shout, but it shines. It doesn't compete, but it captivates. You begin to uplift others just by being yourself. Not because you're preaching, but because you're embodying truth. And the highest truth always speaks louder than words. That's the beauty of divine alignment. It not only transforms you, it elevates everyone around you. There's also a simplicity that begins to emerge. You stop overcomplicating everything. You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to stay aligned, stay present, and stay open. You trust that God's plan is better than your pressure. You begin to realize that rest is not laziness, it's spiritual trust. You stop needing to know every step. You stop trying to control outcomes. Instead, you focus on keeping your vibration pure, your intentions clean, your energy clear, your faith strong. Because when your frequency is high, what's meant for you cannot miss you. It will find you, flow to you, and fit you. That's not fantasy, it's spiritual law. Even your definition of success begins to shift. It's no longer about what you have, but about who you're becoming. It's no longer about being impressive, but being impactful. You realize that true wealth is peace of mind. True achievement is alignment. True freedom is spiritual connection. You stop measuring your life by how far you've gone and start measuring it by how deeply you've tuned in. Because at the end of the day, the external world is just a reflection of your internal state. And when your internal world is vibrating on the frequency of God, there's nothing external that can truly shake you. You begin to understand love in a whole new way. It's not neediness or attachment, it's abundance and wholeness. You stop seeking someone to complete you and start becoming someone complete within yourself. You attract relationships that mirror your self-respect, your clarity, your depth. You begin to love without losing yourself. You give freely but wisely. You see love as a divine exchange, not an emotional transaction. That kind of love can only come from someone who is aligned, because only in alignment can you give from overflow, not emptiness. This frequency also brings a kind of spiritual authority. You stop asking for permission to be who you are. You stop watering yourself down to fit into spaces not meant for your soul. You walk boldly, not arrogantly, but righteously. You stand in your truth, even when it's unpopular. You follow your calling, even when it's lonely. Because when you match the frequency of God, people's opinions begin to lose their power over you. You stop seeking crowds and start seeking truth. And that's when real purpose ignites. That's when destiny starts to move. Your past no longer defines you. Your wounds no longer limit you. Your failures no longer shame you. You realize everything you went through was preparing you for alignment. Every breakdown was a breakthrough. Every heartbreak was a realignment. Every delay was divine protection. When you look back, you no longer feel bitterness, you feel gratitude. Because you understand now, it all had a purpose. It all brought you here, to this frequency, to this peace, to this power. This journey is not a one-time shift. It's a daily tuning, a constant recalibration. You'll drift, you'll lose signal, you'll get distracted. But once you've tasted this frequency, you'll always come back to it. Because nothing else compares, nothing else satisfies. The world can offer you temporary pleasure, but only God can give you eternal peace. That's the frequency your soul was designed for. That's the rhythm your heart beats for. And when you finally live in sync with it, everything begins to change. Not because the world suddenly got easier, but because you finally became aligned with the power that created it. Matching God's frequency isn't about being perfect, it's about being present. The world has conditioned us to chase perfection, to strive for flawlessness in appearance, achievements, and behavior. But divine alignment doesn't ask for perfection. It calls for authenticity. It invites you to show up as you are, with all your doubts, your flaws, your fears, and your faith, and to be fully available in the moment. When you step into presence, you step into power, because God doesn't reside in the past or the future. He resides in the now, in the breath, in the heartbeat, in the stillness between thoughts. And that's where the real transformation begins. Not in what you do, but in how you exist, fully, consciously, gratefully. The more present you become, the more tuned in you are to divine signals. The more you listen not just with your ears, but with your heart, your soul, your intuition. And slowly, gently, something begins to change inside you. You start to see the world differently. The distractions lose their pull. The endless scrolling, the constant noise, the addiction to attention, they begin to feel hollow. Your soul starts craving something deeper. You begin to desire moments of quiet, of solitude, of connection with the unseen. It's not because you're turning your back on the world, but because you're finally turning your face toward God. You start noticing when your energy shifts. You recognize when you've drifted away from peace. You feel it in your body, your breath, your spirit. That awareness is the beginning of alignment. It's the soul whispering, "Come back, return to presence, return to love, return to God." And the more you listen, the more sensitive you become to the vibrations around you. You sense when a space doesn't feel right, even if it looks good. You feel drained by conversations that once felt normal. You begin to sense the energy behind people's words, not just their surface. This isn't paranoia, it's spiritual. Intelligence awakening within you. As you match God's frequency, your discernment sharpens. You're no longer moved by appearance, but by essence. You stop being impressed by flash and start being drawn to depth. You crave authenticity. You seek truth. You become allergic to anything that feels fake, forced, or out of alignment. Even your own thoughts and patterns come under the light. You start to notice how certain beliefs have shaped your reality, and how some of those beliefs were never yours to begin with. Maybe they were inherited, absorbed, or imposed, but now you see them. You see how they've limited your light. And once you see clearly, you can't go back to blindness. That's the cost of awareness. You outgrow illusions, and the gift of awareness, you walk in truth. You begin to recognize that not all silence is empty. Some silence is sacred. It's in the stillness that you begin to hear what your busy life kept drowning out. The voice of your soul, the whispers of divine guidance, the gentle corrections and confirmations. You realize that sometimes the reason you couldn't hear God wasn't because He wasn't speaking, but because your life was too loud. Now, as you create more space for quiet, you find that presence is not passive, it's powerful. In presence, you heal. In presence, you receive. In presence, you remember who you are and whose you are. You become more mindful of what you consume, not just food, but information, conversations, environments, because you understand that everything carries a frequency. And not everything is meant to enter your sacred space. You become intentional with your time, your energy, your boundaries. You stop explaining your shift, and you simply honor it. Because once your soul tastes alignment, you can't go back to what was draining you. You start shedding layers you didn't even know you were wearing. The need to be liked, the desire to please, the compulsion to compare, the fear of rejection. They begin to loosen their grip. Because as you draw closer to God's frequency, you begin to see yourself through His eyes, not as flawed, but as forming, not as lacking, but as learning, not as broken, but as being rebuilt. This new perspective changes how you carry yourself. You walk with a quieter confidence. You don't have to announce your worth, that radiates from your spirit. You stop competing because you realize there's no race. You stop proving because you understand you're already chosen. You begin to understand that success in God's frequency isn't about status, it's about surrender. It's not about accumulation, it's about alignment. The more you release, the more you rise. The world will still test you. It will pull you in all directions. People will question your peace, provoke your silence, misunderstand your growth. But when you're tuned in, you no longer react from ego, you respond from soul. You don't fight to be right, you fight to remain aligned. You don't need to win every argument you need to win your peace. You start to guard your energy like treasure. You choose your battles wisely. You pick your words carefully. You understand the power of presence, and you refuse to waste it on anything that pulls you out of alignment. That's not weakness, it's wisdom. And wisdom is what begins to guide your steps when you match God's frequency. You begin to move with intention. You pause before responding. You pray before deciding. You align before acting. This internal alignment starts to shape your external reality. As your vibration rises, some people will fall away, not because you're pushing them, but because your energy no longer matches theirs. That's okay. Not everyone is meant to go where you're going. Some connections were only meant for certain chapters. Others were never rooted in truth to begin with. Matching God's frequency often means walking away from familiar but unhealthy patterns. Relationships, habits, mindsets. It means choosing growth over comfort. It means honoring your peace over pleasing people. It means making decisions that feel right in your spirit, even if they don't make sense on paper. That's the kind of courage divine alignment gives you. You stop needing external confirmation. You start trusting internal conviction. Because when God is the one guiding you, you don't need a crowd, you just need clarity. Your prayers change. 2, they become less about asking and more about aligning. Less about outcomes and more about openness. You stop praying for things and start praying for understanding. You stop demanding answers and start seeking alignment. You begin to pray, not from fear or lack, but from love and trust. Your conversations with God become constant, not just in crises, but in the quiet moments, in the mundane routines, in the simple joys. You begin to live in communion, not just communication. That kind of spiritual intimacy changes everything. It makes you unshakable, not because life stops testing you, but because your foundation becomes unmovable. You begin to understand that the real miracle isn't in what changes around you, but in what awakens within you. Even your relationship with time begins to shift. You stop rushing. You stop forcing. You trust the process. You surrender the timeline. You understand that delay is not denial. That waiting is not wasting. That what's meant for you is already being prepared for you. And all you need to do is stay aligned. You stop micromanaging your destiny. You start flowing with divine timing. This doesn't mean passivity, it means peace in the process. It means action from a place of trust, not desperation. You still do your part, but you let God do His. And that trust becomes your resting place. There are moments where doubt creeps in, where the old frequency tries to pull you back, where the familiar fear resurfaces. But now, you catch it faster. You recognize the energy. You shift it before it settles. That's growth. Not perfection, but quicker recovery, quicker return to alignment. Because once you've tasted this peace, you know when you've drifted. You know what alignment feels like, and you protect it like your most sacred possession. Because it is. Nothing in this world is worth losing that connection. No amount of applause, attention, or achievement is worth the cost of spiritual disconnection. You begin to value your relationship with God more than the rewards of the world. You notice how even your body responds to alignment. You feel lighter, freer, calmer. Your breath becomes deeper. Your sleep more restful. Your presence more magnetic. Your health begins to improve, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Because when your spirit is aligned, your body follows. You stop carrying emotional baggage. You release resentment. You forgive, not for others, but for your own liberation. You let go of guilt that was never yours to begin with. You stop punishing yourself for past versions of you that didn't know better. You embrace your becoming. You celebrate your growth. And you understand that every step, even the messy ones, were part of your divine unfolding. This journey isn't always linear. Some days you'll feel deeply connected, and other days you'll feel distant. That's okay. Alignment is a practice, not a destination. It's a rhythm, not a rule. It requires grace, not guilt. On the days you feel lost, you return. On the days you fall, you rise. On the days you forget, you remember. Because once you've made the decision to align with God's frequency, you'll always find your way back. His voice will always call you home. His presence will always be your compass. His love will always be your anchor. And slowly, steadily, you'll begin to live not just in moments of alignment, but in a state of it, a state where peace is your default, where faith is your foundation, where love is your language. You stop fearing the unknown. You stop needing all the answers. You embrace mystery. You find comfort in not knowing, because you know who does. You surrender your need for control and lean into divine wisdom. That surrender becomes your strength. That trust becomes your shield. That alignment becomes your superpower. And through it all, you realize that matching God's frequency wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who you've always been underneath the noise. A soul tuned to love, a spirit wired for light, a being created in the image of the divine. Matching God's frequency brings clarity in chaos. There's a divine rhythm operating in the background of our lives, and most people miss it because they're too distracted trying to orchestrate their own soundtrack. They fight against the current, forcing outcomes, chasing timelines, obsessing over control, while deep within, their soul is calling them to slow down and listen. When you finally tune in to that divine frequency, you stop moving from pressure and start moving from purpose. You stop reacting impulsively and start responding intentionally. You begin to flow with the rhythm of trust. There's a harmony that emerges from within, a peace that can't be explained by logic or understood by intellect. It's a sense of knowing that even in the midst of uncertainty, something greater is guiding your steps. The need to manipulate and force fades away. Instead, you become open to what's meant to unfold. It's not weakness, it's wisdom, because you now know that everything that truly belongs in your life will stay, and everything that doesn't will fall away with time, clarity, and grace. This clarity isn't just intellectual, it's energetic. You start to notice how certain things no longer resonate with you. It's not that the world changed, it's that you did. What once thrilled you now feels draining. What once seemed urgent now feels irrelevant. You become aware of the subtle ways your spirit is communicating with you. You feel a heaviness when something is off. You feel a lightness when something is right. You start measuring life by peace, not productivity. You begin to honor your energy instead of constantly depleting it. You stop forcing conversations that don't flow. You stop chasing relationships that feel misaligned. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. This is not pride, it's preservation. When you're operating from divine alignment, you protect your peace like it's sacred because it is. You start to walk through life like someone who understands their worth, not arrogantly, but securely. You also begin to realize that your worth isn't tied to your performance. You are valuable not because of what you achieve, but because of who you are. You don't need to prove your importance to anyone. Your existence is proof enough. And once you internalize that, everything changes. You don't chase opportunities, you prepare for them. You don't beg for love, you embody it. You don't seek validation, you live in your truth. And when you show up in this frequency, you naturally attract what aligns. Opportunities, relationships, blessings, they begin to find you because you are vibrating at the level of divine intention. You don't need to fight for a seat at a table that was never meant for you. You realize that the table meant for you has already been prepared. You just need to walk in your purpose and keep your spirit clean enough to recognize it. When it appears, this clarity transforms your relationship with waiting. Most people dread the in-between, the season of silence, the time when nothing seems to be happening. But when you're tuned into God's frequency, you understand that stillness is not absence. It's preparation, it's refinement, it's divine alignment. You stop rushing the process because you understand that everything good and holy takes time to form. Flowers don't bloom overnight. Rivers don't carve valleys in a day. Your soul is being shaped by the waiting, the wrestling, the wondering. And so instead of panicking in the pause, you begin to rest in it. You start listening more closely. You begin asking different questions, not why is this happening, but what is God trying to show me? And when you shift the question, the answer eventually reveals itself in unexpected ways. Matching God's frequency gives you spiritual foresight. You begin to see the end from the middle. You sense possibilities others can't yet perceive. You don't need to see the full staircase, you just need to take the next right step. And you do. Not because you have certainty, but because you have alignment. You move from conviction, not convenience. You begin to operate from a higher understanding that your life isn't random, and your path isn't aimless. even when it looks like nothing is working. Something divine is always unfolding behind the scenes. You start to live like someone who is being guided because you are, and that belief becomes the lens through which you see everything. It's a holy confidence not rooted in ego, but in trust. The world around you may still be loud, chaotic, and uncertain, but inside, there's a steadiness growing. You're no longer dependent on outer circumstances to feel peace. You don't need everything to be perfect to feel grateful. You begin to develop a deeper emotional resilience. You don't get thrown off by every little thing. You feel disappointment, but you don't drown in it. You experience pain, but you don't become bitter. You have doubts, but you don't let them drive you. That's because your anchor is no longer your circumstances, it's your creator. Your foundation is no longer fear, it's faith. That's what clarity in chaos feels like. You are in the storm, but the storm is no longer in you. This shift becomes most powerful in how you treat others. When you're tuned into divine frequency, your compassion deepens. You don't need to judge everyone's journey, you respect their timing. You don't need to compete because you believe in abundance. You don't need to hold grudges because you've experienced the mercy of God, and now you offer it to others. You speak less to be heard and more to uplift. You listen more, not just with ears, but with empathy. Your presence becomes healing, not because you're trying, but because you're aligned. You radiate peace, you carry calm, you bring light into heavy places, and that light doesn't come from you, it flows through you. You've become a vessel for something higher, and that realization humbles you, grounds you, and inspires you to keep tuning in no matter what. When you live in this frequency, you also start to love yourself in a healthier way. You stop beating yourself up for past mistakes. You stop comparing your path to others. You begin to honor your process. You realize that healing isn't linear, growth isn't instant, and alignment is a daily choice. You give yourself grace. You talk to yourself kindly. You begin to treat your own soul with the same reverence you would offer a sacred temple, because that's what you are, a sacred vessel for divine light. And when you carry yourself with that awareness, the world treats you differently, not because it has changed, but because you have. The more you align, the more your outer world reflects your inner state. Things start working out not because life suddenly got easier, but because you stop blocking your blessings with fear and doubt. You begin to flow. You take inspired action. You trust your intuition. You walk through open doors and you stop knocking on closed ones. You understand that rejection is protection. That delay is design. That detours are divine. You don't need to chase anything. What's for you knows how to find you, and more importantly, it knows how to keep you. In this state, your energy becomes currency. You begin to notice how everything you give your attention to is either investing in your future or stealing from your peace. So you become more mindful. You stop wasting your days numbing your spirit. You start feeding your soul with truth, beauty, stillness, and service. You become intentional about your words. You choose your influences carefully. You guard your heart like a sacred altar, because you understand that what you allow in will eventually flow out, and you want what flows out to be pure, uplifting, and life-giving. Even your goals begin to shift. You no longer ask, "What can I get?" but "Who can I become?" You understand that true success isn't about accumulation, it's about transformation. It's about becoming a person who lives in integrity with their highest self, a person who doesn't just talk about faith, but walks in it, a person whose life is a reflection of divine alignment, not perfection, but authenticity. You stop measuring progress by external benchmarks. You start measuring it by internal peace, clarity, and presence. And that kind of growth may not be flashy, but it's real, it's lasting, it's sacred. This clarity also helps you navigate relationships in a deeper way. You begin to sense who drains you and who uplifts you, who adds to your light and who dims it. You no longer keep people around out of obligation or history. You choose relationships that are mutual, nourishing, and spiritually aligned. You let go with love, and you embrace with intention. You stop trying to change others and focus instead on being the change. Your relationships become mirrors not of your flaws, but of your growth. And even when conflict arises, you handle it from a higher place. You seek understanding, not dominance. You seek healing, not winning. You prioritize connection over ego. And in doing so, you create spaces of safety, truth, and transformation. Living in alignment doesn't mean life stops being hard, it means you become more equipped. You see lessons in pain. You find wisdom in waiting. You discover grace in grief. Your spiritual muscles strengthen. You become unshaken by storms that used to wreck you. Not because you're cold or numb, but because you're anchored. Anchored in something eternal, unchanging, divine. And that anchor doesn't prevent the waves, but it keeps you steady in the middle of them. That's the kind of strength no one can give you. It comes from within, built slowly, layer by layer. As you continue tuning in to the highest frequency, you also begin to co-create with God in ways you never imagined. Your dreams become bolder because your fears are smaller. Your vision expands because your trust deepens. You begin to understand that your desires, when aligned with purpose, are not selfish, they're sacred. They're the language your soul uses to point you toward your divine assignment. You no longer suppress your dreams, you surrender them. You say, "Use me." You offer your gifts, your talents, your time as an offering, and in return, you experience a kind of fulfillment that no amount of worldly success can replicate. You wake up with purpose. You move through the day with peace. You rest at night with gratitude. All of this begins with tuning in, with silencing the static, with returning again and again to that still place within where God speaks, where clarity lives, where peace is born. The more you tune in, the more you become who you were always meant to be, not a copy of the world, but a reflection of the divine. And once you live in that truth, everything begins to change, not just around you, but within you, through you, and beyond you. When you match God's frequency, healing begins to happen in ways you never imagined. Not through dramatic events or lightning bolt moments, but through quiet, gentle transformations that touch the soul. It begins with a whisper deep within, a stirring you can't quite explain. You start to feel like certain things no longer fit, not because they're broken, but because you've outgrown them. Pain that used to define you begins to lose its grip. Grudges that once felt justified start to feel heavy. The emotions you buried, the heartbreak you tried to ignore, the wounds you covered up with busyness or bravado, suddenly they rise to the surface, not to destroy you, but to be healed. God's frequency draws all that's hidden into the light, not to shame you, but to free you. Because healing can't happen in darkness. Healing is a divine unraveling, a sacred process of remembering who you were before the world wounded you. It begins with awareness. You start to see your patterns more clearly. You begin to realize how much of your life was shaped by fear, by survival, by wounds that were never fully addressed. You recognize how you've been carrying pain that didn't belong to you. Pain passed down through generations. Pain absorbed from broken relationships. Pain caused by your own choices when you didn't know better. And instead of running from it, you begin to face it. Slowly, courageously, tenderly. You let yourself feel what you've avoided. You give yourself permission to cry without apology. You stop pretending to be okay when you're not. That's not weakness, that's alignment. Because matching God's frequency means being honest about where you are, even when it's messy. You realize God doesn't need perfection, He wants your presence, your truth, your rawness. You finally understand that vulnerability is not the opposite of strength, it's the beginning of it. As you continue to tune in, you begin to see forgiveness in a new light. It's not something you do to approve of what happened. It's something you do to unkind your soul from the past. Forgiveness isn't about pretending it didn't hurt. It's about refusing to let the pain define your identity. You begin to realize that holding onto anger is like clutching shards of glass. You only keep bleeding, but when you release it, something miraculous happens. You begin to heal. You stop reliving the same emotional patterns. You stop expecting people to fix what they broke. You stop needing closure from others and start creating peace within yourself. That's divine alignment when you choose healing even when you have every right to stay hurt. You start rewriting the story. Where there used to be shame, you begin to see strength. Where there was guilt, you begin to see growth. You stop identifying with your trauma and begin identifying with your transformation. Your scars no longer scream pain, they whisper resilience. You look in the mirror and see someone who has walked through fire and is still standing. Someone who has known deep sorrow and still chooses joy. Someone who has tasted darkness and still shines light. That recognition changes how you show up in the world. You no longer try to prove your worth, you live from it. You no longer seek healing outside, you carry it within. As you go deeper, your soul begins to release more than just emotional pain. You start letting go of toxic mindsets that kept you small, thoughts that told you you're not enough, lies that said you'd never heal, voices from the past that told you to shrink, to settle, to stay silent. You challenge them now, not with force, but with truth. You replace the lies with affirmations rooted in divine identity. You remind yourself, I am loved, I am chosen, I am enough. And slowly, those new truths begin to sink in. They take root. They grow into new beliefs. And those beliefs begin to shape a new reality. Because healing isn't just about feeling better, it's about becoming someone new, someone freer, someone lighter, someone more aligned with their divine essence. You begin to notice how healing shows up in your body. The tightness in your chest begins to ease. The weight on your shoulders starts to lift. You sleep more peacefully. You breathe more deeply. You walk more mindfully. Your body starts to reflect the peace your soul is finding. And when old wounds try to resurface, you meet them with compassion, not judgment. You understand now that healing isn't linear. Some days feel like progress, others feel like setbacks. But you no longer measure your growth by how quickly the pain disappears. You measure it by how gently you respond to it, how often you return to love, how deeply you trust the process. Relationships begin to shift, too. As you heal, you start attracting different energies. You're no longer drawn to chaos because it feels familiar. You begin craving peace. You stop settling for love that hurts. You stop calling pain passion. You start recognizing what healthy love feels like: safe, kind, patient, consistent. And because you now carry that energy within, you recognize it outside of you. The people you once tolerated, you begin to release, not from hate, but from clarity, not from bitterness, but from alignment. You start creating space for people who nourish your spirit, people who see you, honor you, support your healing, people who match your new frequency. And you no longer fear losing others, because you've already found yourself. You also start to forgive yourself, maybe for staying too long, maybe for loving too hard, maybe for abandoning yourself to be loved by others. You stop punishing yourself for the decisions you made in survival mode. You look back at your past self, and instead of shame, you feel empathy. You see someone doing their best with the tools they had. You offer yourself the grace you once denied. That inner forgiveness is the key to freedom, because you can't live in peace while still fighting yourself. You begin to nurture the parts of you that felt neglected. You speak kindly to the inner child who still lives within you. You remind them, you're safe now, you're seen now, you're held now. That's how healing begins to transform your inner world. As you continue matching God's frequency, your sense of identity becomes more rooted in truth. You realize you're not your pain, you're not your past, you're not the labels others placed on you, you're not your worst moment, you're not your failures. You are a soul on a journey back to wholeness. And that awareness gives you permission to grow, to evolve, to be more than what you've experienced. You stop living in reaction to life and begin living from a place of intention. You wake up with a sense of purpose, not because life is perfect, but because you're connected to something perfect. Your worth is no longer conditional. It's inherent, it's divine, it's unshakable. Your view of pain also changes. You stop asking, why did this happen to me, and start asking, what is this here to teach me? You start seeing challenges as invitations to deepen your faith. You recognize that sometimes pain is the catalyst for the most beautiful transformations. The wound becomes the womb where new strength is born. And even though you wouldn't wish the suffering on anyone, you begin to thank it for shaping you, for waking you up, for leading you home to yourself and to God. That shift in perspective is a powerful part of healing, because it means the pain no longer has power over you, it now serves you. This kind of deep healing doesn't always look pretty. Sometimes it looks like saying no when you're used to saying yes. Sometimes it looks like crying in your car when no one else knows what you're carrying. Sometimes it means walking away from people who expect you to stay broken. Sometimes it's messy, uncertain, lonely. But through it all, you begin to feel a divine presence that doesn't leave. You feel held when no one else is around. You feel guided even when the path isn't clear. You feel seen in your most vulnerable moments. That's how you know you're Not healing alone, you're healing in the presence of God. And that changes everything. You begin to dream again, hope again, believe again. Things you once thought were impossible start to feel within reach. Not because you've figured it all out, but because you've stopped blocking what's meant for you. Healing clears the debris that was clouding your vision. It softens your heart. It opens you to new possibilities. You no longer sabotage joy, you welcome it. You stop pushing away love, you receive it. You no longer reject peace, you protect it. You live with open hands, open heart, open spirit. Not because you trust the world, but because you trust the one who holds the world. You also begin to lead others through your healing, not by preaching, but by embodying. People sense your calm, your depth, your light. They ask how you did it. They want to know what changed, and your story becomes your offering. Your scars become someone else's survival guide. Your healing becomes hope. That's the beautiful ripple effect of alignment. It doesn't stop with you, it flows through you to others. You become a walking testimony of what happens when you tune into something higher, something holy, something eternal. And every day, you recommit. You keep choosing healing. You keep choosing peace. You keep choosing alignment, because you now know what it feels like to live disconnected, and you refuse to go back. You've tasted the freedom. You've felt the presence. You've experienced the shift. And even when life gets hard again, even when wounds reopen, even when old patterns resurface, you know where to return. You know how to realign. You know that healing is not a destination, but a devotion. And every time you choose it, you move closer to wholeness. You move closer to truth. You move closer to God. When you match God's frequency, your inner voice begins to speak louder than the noise of the world. That voice, the one you used to ignore, becomes your compass. It doesn't scream, it whispers. But the more you listen, the clearer it becomes. You start noticing things you once overlooked. Small moments begin to carry weight. A soft breeze feels like a message. A stranger's smile feels like a reminder. You begin to live in the now, because the now becomes sacred. You stop chasing what's ahead and start honoring what's here. You no longer need constant stimulation or validation to feel alive. You become grounded, calm, centered. Because when you vibrate at God's frequency, peace is no longer something you seek, it's something you carry. You realize the greatest power isn't found in controlling life, but in surrendering to it. You stop resisting what's unfolding and begin trusting what's being written. Even when the path makes no sense, your heart knows it's divine. Fear begins to lose its grip, not because you never feel afraid, but because you no longer let fear decide your actions. You've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the choice to move forward despite it. And you make that choice more often now. You step into rooms you once avoided. You speak words you once swallowed. You pursue dreams you once buried. And though the fear may still whisper, it no longer drives. What drives you now is faith, a quiet, steady, unshakable faith that reminds you you are being guided. Even when you can't see the next step, you trust that it will appear. That kind of faith changes everything. It silences doubt. It calms anxiety. It brings light to the darkness in your mind. You stop asking, what if I fail? And start asking, what if this is exactly where I'm meant to be? This new frequency begins to shape the way you think. Your thoughts aren't as reactive anymore. You don't spiral the way you used to. When pain shows up, you don't let it drown you. You observe it, you feel it, and then you let it pass. You no longer believe every thought that enters your mind. You question them now. You challenge the stories. You ask yourself, is this truth or is this trauma? You replace fear-based thoughts with truth-based affirmations. You remind yourself that you are loved. You remind yourself that you are safe. You remind yourself that God is with you in every breath, in every tear, in every silence. You begin to rewire the patterns that once kept you stuck. The mind, once your prison, becomes your sanctuary, and that inner transformation reflects in your outer world. Your energy begins to shift. People feel it. Some are drawn closer. Some pull away, not because you've changed too much, but because you've finally stopped shrinking. You've stopped dimming your light to make others comfortable. You've stopped apologizing for your truth. And not everyone can handle that. But you've made peace with that too, because your worth is no longer attached to people's acceptance. It's rooted in something higher, something eternal. You no longer need to prove anything. You simply live in alignment, and that alignment becomes magnetic. You attract experiences that match your peace, opportunities that match your purpose, people that match your growth, not because you chase them, but because you become them. You start protecting your space, not from a place of fear, but from a place of sacred respect. You guard your time, your energy, your heart. You set boundaries, not to keep people out, but to keep your peace in. You say no without guilt. You walk away without drama. You speak up without shame. You stop over-explaining and start honoring. You no longer allow chaos to dictate your rhythm. You choose what aligns. You release what doesn't. And in doing so, you begin to experience true freedom, not the kind the world sells, not the kind built on escape or excess, but the kind that comes from knowing who you are and who you belong to. Stillness becomes a refuge. Silence no longer scares you. In fact, you seek it, because it's in the silence that you hear him, not with your ears but with your soul. In the quiet, you feel clarity, you feel direction, you feel love. You realize you've spent so much of your life running from silence, trying to fill the void with noise, people, distractions. But now you understand that the silence was never empty, it was full of him. You stop rushing. You stop forcing. You learn the art of waiting. You learn that delay doesn't mean denial. You realize that sometimes God's not yet his protection, in disguise, and so you wait not in frustration, but in faith. Gratitude becomes your natural state. You stop waiting for big miracles to feel thankful. You see the miracle in the mundane. A sunrise becomes a sermon. A deep breath becomes a blessing. A quiet moment becomes a gift. You begin to count your joys instead of your worries. You begin to notice how much you have, not how much you lack. And that shift creates abundance, not just financially but spiritually, emotionally, mentally. You feel full, whole, complete, even when life isn't perfect, because you're no longer looking for perfection, you're looking for presence. You're no longer chasing happiness, you're choosing joy, and that joy begins to multiply. You also start seeing others differently. You become more compassionate, more patient, more understanding. You no longer judge people for their brokenness, you recognize it. You see your old self in their struggle, and instead of condemning, you extend grace. You become a safe space, a quiet light. You stop needing to be right and start choosing to be kind. You stop seeing people as problems and start seeing them as souls. You no longer take things personally, you understand projection. You no longer absorb their pain, you witness it. You love without attachment. You give without expectation. You serve without resentment. Because your love is no longer based on ego, it's based on spirit. Your creativity begins to awaken. Ideas flow. Inspiration strikes. Not because you're pushing, but because you're aligned. You tap into a source bigger than yourself. You stop trying to impress and start trying to express. You create from wholeness, not from lack. You speak truth even if your voice shakes. You paint, write, sing, build not for applause, but for purpose. Your work becomes worship. Your passion becomes prayer. Your dreams become sacred assignments. And you begin to walk in purpose with a quiet confidence that says, I was made for this. Old habits begin to fall away, not because you're forcing change, but because they no longer match your frequency. Addictions lose their grip. Destructive cycles unravel. You begin choosing what nourishes over what numbs. You stop escaping and start engaging. You stop reacting and start responding. You stop hiding and start healing. You begin to love your body not because it's perfect, but because it carries your spirit. You treat it with care. You move it with joy. You feed it with respect, because it's not just a vessel, it's a temple. And when you treat your body like it's sacred, it begins to respond in sacred ways. Time slows down. You stop living in the past. You stop fearing the future. You return to the present again and again, because the present is where life happens, where God speaks, where healing unfolds. You learn that your breath is holy, that your heartbeat is divine, that your presence is a gift. You no longer need grand gestures to feel alive. You find magic in the ordinary, peace in the routine, joy in the simplicity. Life becomes less about achieving and more about aligning, less about performing and more about being. You begin to trust yourself deeply, intuitively. You no longer second-guess every move. You stop seeking constant advice. You realize you are connected to wisdom that surpasses logic. You begin to make decisions from your spirit, not just your mind. You honor your yes and respect your no. You trust your gut, even when others doubt it. Because you know, when you're aligned with God's frequency, your intuition is sacred. It's not just your voice, it's His whisper. Even in suffering, you find meaning. You stop asking for a painless life. You start asking for a purposeful one. You stop praying for comfort and start praying for courage. You realize that pain can purify, that struggle can strengthen, that loss can lead. And in the fire, you are not alone. You are being refined. You are being shaped. You are being elevated. And when the tears come, you let them. You no longer see them as weakness but as release, as cleansing, as sacred expression. Because your tears are prayers too. You begin to carry less. You stop carrying what isn't yours, the expectations, the comparisons, the guilt, the shame. You set it down. You travel lighter, freer. You hold space for others, but don't lose yourself in the process. You give, but not from depletion. You serve, but not from striving. You love, but not from lack. You begin to overflow. And from that overflow, you offer, you pour, you uplift, and it's never forced, never performative, just real, just pure, just aligned. You wake up differently. You walk differently. You speak differently. Not because you're trying to be better, but because you've become better. By simply being. The world hasn't changed, but you have. And because you've changed, everything looks different, sounds different, feels different. Not louder but clearer, not faster but deeper, not shinier but truer. You are no longer just existing. You are living, breathing, aligning, healing, becoming, tuning in, rising higher, holding steady, letting go, starting over, trusting more, receiving fully, giving freely, walking quietly, loving bravely, choosing peace, matching the frequency of God. When you begin to operate on God's frequency, your entire perception of time, pressure, and purpose transforms. No longer do you feel in a rush to compete, compare, or catch up with others. You begin to understand that divine timing has no rivalry. You aren't behind. You aren't late. You're exactly where you're meant to be. That shift in perspective releases the weight you've been carrying, the weight of expectations, the weight of perfectionism, the weight of proving your worth. Suddenly, you breathe easier. You stop measuring your value by how fast you move or how much you accomplish. You start honoring the process, however slow or subtle it may seem. You realize that even the silent seasons serve a purpose. The moments when nothing appears to be happening are often when the deepest growth is taking place. Just as a seed pushes through the soil in darkness before it breaks into the light, your soul is developing strength in HIDDENNESS. You begin to let go of force. You stop trying to control outcomes. You stop trying to manipulate timelines. You no longer chase what's not yours. Instead, you align yourself with truth and let what's meant for you find you. This is not passivity, this is powerful surrender. It's the kind of surrender that doesn't mean giving up, but giving into something greater. You start working with the flow of life instead of against it. You become less reactive and more receptive. You start to notice divine patterns, how closed doors protected you, how delays shaped you, how detours were directions in disguise. And with that awareness, your heart opens. You begin to trust the unknown. You stop fearing what's coming and start welcoming it. When you live at God's frequency, prayer becomes your language, not just in the moments you close your eyes and kneel, but in every breath, every thought, every step. Your life becomes a living prayer. Gratitude starts before the blessing arrives. You thank Him in advance because your faith sees what your eyes don't. You stop praying only for what you want and start praying for what you need. You ask for peace instead of possessions, wisdom instead of wealth, alignment instead of applause. And those prayers begin to change you. They clear your vision. They sharpen your spirit. They help you see past the surface. You begin to discern what's real from what's empty. You begin to feel more than you judge. You become less concerned with image and more aligned with essence. You begin to understand that every interaction is a spiritual exchange. Every person who enters your life carries energy, intention, and story. You no longer treat people as background. Noise, you see them as sacred. You listen more. You speak less. You become more intentional with your words. You stop gossiping. You stop complaining. You stop cursing the very breath that gives you life. Your words shift from weapons to healing tools. You bless others with your speech. You affirm yourself with kindness. You pray over people instead of talking about them. And the more you do that, the more your environment transforms. Your home becomes peaceful. Your relationships become deeper. Even strangers feel safe around your presence. You also become more attuned to your emotions. You no longer suppress them or allow them to explode. You observe them like passing clouds, real, but not permanent. You give yourself permission to feel without judgment. Sadness isn't a failure. Anger isn't evil. Joy isn't indulgent. You stop labeling your feelings and start learning from them. Each emotion becomes a teacher. Each sensation becomes a message. You realize that feeling is part of healing. That to numb your pain is to delay your growth. So you lean into it. You cry when you need to. You rest when you must. You forgive not because they asked, but because you deserve peace. You stop seeking closure from others and start creating it. Within yourself, you stop begging others to understand and start standing in your truth. When you vibrate at God's frequency, love becomes a way of life, not a transaction. You stop loving to receive. You start loving to reflect. You love without keeping score. You give without waiting for return. You realize love isn't something you find, it's something you become. And when you become it, it flows out of you effortlessly. You love people who cannot repay you. You show compassion to those who never asked. You serve in silence. You help in hiddenness. Because you know that God sees what the world overlooks, and His approval is enough. That love changes lives, not by force, but by presence, not by pressure, but by consistency. You stop trying to fix people and start showing them what healing looks like. You also become aware of the power of your attention. What you focus on expands. What you give energy to grows. You stop feeding fear. You stop watering doubt. You shift your gaze from problems to possibilities. You start focusing on what is working, on what is beautiful, on what is sacred. You no longer wake up dreading the day. You wake up with intention, with purpose, with quiet strength. You start your mornings with reflection instead of reaction. You don't scroll through chaos, you sit with clarity. You read, you write, you meditate, you listen. And those small habits compound into big shifts. Your day moves differently. Your pace slows. Your joy deepens. Your relationship with yourself transforms. You stop treating yourself like a project. You start honoring yourself like a masterpiece. You stop criticizing your flaws and start celebrating your resilience. You speak to yourself gently. You hold your own hand through hard moments. You become your own safe space. Your self-worth no longer depends on productivity. You learn to rest without guilt. You learn to say no without fear. You treat yourself the way God treats you, with grace, with patience, with unwavering love. You begin to experience abundance on a soul level. You realize abundance isn't just about having more, it's about recognizing what you already have. You see richness in relationships, not just bank accounts. You feel wealth in your health, your laughter, your freedom. You stop hoarding and start sharing. You give from overflow, not obligation. And in that giving, you multiply. The more you give, the more you receive, not always materially, but spiritually, emotionally, energetically. You stop clinging and start releasing, because you trust that what you need will always find you. You operate from sufficiency, not scarcity. And that changes how you work, how you spend, how you live. Your dreams begin to feel possible again, not because the road got easier, but because your belief got stronger. You stop doubting your vision. You start walking toward it, step by step, even when it's hard, even when it's quiet, even when no one claps, because you're no longer doing it for recognition. You're doing it from conviction, from a calling, from a place that says, this matters, this is mine, this is sacred. And because you trust that, you stay consistent, you keep showing up, you keep creating, you keep sowing. And eventually, the harvest comes. You redefine success. No longer is it just status or spotlight. Success becomes alignment, fulfillment, impact, peace. You measure success by how much you've grown, how deeply you've loved, how gently you've walked through the fire. You stop trying to impress and start trying to serve. You stop climbing ladders and start building bridges. You no longer fear obscurity, you value integrity. You would rather be authentic and unknown than visible and empty. And that shift brings peace. You rest better at night. You smile more often. You carry less shame. You become more resilient. Not hardened, but softened in strength. Life still throws storms your way. Pain still visits. Loss still hurts. But you don't crumble the way you used to. You don't run from the rain, you know. The rain nourishes. You've learned to dance in it. You've learned that your roots go deeper than the surface. That your foundation is built on rock, not sand. That storms reveal what cannot be shaken. And you discover that your faith is unshakable. Not loud, but steady. Not dramatic, but enduring. You've seen too much to stop believing. You've survived too much to lose hope. You become a light. Not because you shine the brightest, but because you shine the truest. Your light isn't about perfection, it's about presence. People feel safe around you. Not because you have all the answers, but because you listen. You empathize. You hold space. You reflect love in its purest form. And you don't have to try hard. You just have to be. Because when you're aligned with God, He shines through you. Your presence becomes healing. Your silence becomes comforting. Your story becomes inspiration. You begin to see how nothing was wasted. Not the heartbreak, not the failure, not the waiting. It all served a purpose. It all brought you here. To this frequency, to this clarity, to this depth. You no longer regret. The past, you redeem it. You use it to lift others. To remind them that brokenness doesn't disqualify, it prepares. That pain doesn't ruin, it refines. That even your darkest chapter holds light when read from the perspective of grace. You learn to listen differently. Not just to words, but to energy, to silence, to intuition. You hear what people aren't saying. You feel the spaces between the sentences. And that listening helps you love better. Serve better, speak better. You no longer fill space just to avoid discomfort. You let silence breathe. You let moments unfold. You don't rush to fix, you honor the process. You start building your life around alignment, not ambition. You stop asking, what will make me look successful? And start asking, what will make me feel alive? You create space for rest, for joy, for connection. You stop glorifying busyness. You stop sacrificing your soul for schedules. You protect your peace the way others protect their status. You prioritize depth over speed, meaning over noise. You start seeing beauty everywhere. In the laugh lines of an old face, in the stillness of the morning, in the resilience of a flower growing through concrete. You no longer overlook the small. You cherish it. You no longer dismiss the quiet. You welcome it. The world slows down. In your spirit, even when it speeds up around you, and in that stillness, you hear Him more clearly than ever. When your soul begins to truly vibrate at God's frequency, something fundamental shifts inside you. The noise of the world that once kept you restless no longer holds power over you. You stop feeling pulled in every direction. The distractions lose their grip, and your clarity sharpens. It's not that the chaos outside stops, it's that the chaos inside quiets. You're no longer swayed by trends, by opinions, by the pressure to perform. You begin to live from the inside out instead of the outside in. That's when you realize your true power was never in how loud you could be, but in how still you could remain in the midst of everything. That stillness becomes your sanctuary. It becomes your secret place, where you hear not just your thoughts, but the whisper of divine guidance. You stop searching for signs in the sky and start recognizing the signs already buried deep in your heart. Your decisions begin to look different, no longer based on fear or urgency, but on peace. You don't move because you're anxious, you move because you're led. You don't say yes to everything, you honor your no with the same strength as your yes. You stop making decisions just to avoid discomfort or delay disappointment. You start choosing paths that align with your values, your truth, and your calling. The world might not always understand your choices, but you're no longer living for understanding, you're living for alignment. And that internal harmony is worth more than external applause. You feel whole, even when you're healing, even when life feels incomplete. Because wholeness doesn't mean perfection, it means presence. You begin to detach from outcomes. You no longer base your identity on achievements, whether something succeeds or fails. Your worth remains unchanged. You show up fully, give your best, and then let go. You stop gripping so tightly. You stop trying to control every variable. You understand that your job is to plant, to water, to nurture, not to force the harvest. That shift relieves the pressure. It brings you back to peace. You become more fluid, more adaptable, more in tune with divine flow. You recognize that resistance often comes when you're trying to force something that was never meant to fit. So you release, you breathe, you trust, you let things unfold in divine timing. And in that surrender, you find a rhythm that is both peaceful and powerful. People begin to notice something different about you, even if they can't name it. They feel safer around you. They feel seen, even without speaking. That's the power of presence. That's what happens when you start matching the frequency of your Creator. You carry a calmness that doesn't come from a lack of problems, but from the presence of deep spiritual connection. You no longer need to prove your intelligence, your goodness, your strength. You just live it, quietly, consistently, authentically. And that quiet power draws others in, not to admire you, but to remember something within themselves. Your alignment becomes a mirror, reminding others what they've forgotten about their own soul. You become a vessel for healing, for peace, for awakening. Your inner dialogue transforms. You no longer speak to yourself with cruelty or criticism. You become your own encourager, your own comforter, your own ally. You speak words that uplift, not only to others but to yourself. You recognize how sacred your thoughts are, how they shape your emotions, your energy, your life. So you guard them, you choose them with care, you redirect them when they wander into fear. You rewrite the scripts that were written in pain. No longer do you replay the old wounds like they're part of your identity. You honor them for what they taught you, and then you let them go. You stop telling the story of your brokenness and start telling the story of your becoming. Your relationship with time evolves. You stop seeing time as a threat and start seeing it as a gift. You no longer feel behind. You don't rush through moments. You become present in your own life, fully here, fully alive. You savor your mornings. You give attention to your evenings. You begin to live slow enough to notice beauty, to create meaning, to feel connection. Even in the simple things, the warmth of sunlight through a window, the laughter of someone you love, the quiet hum of life continuing. These become sacred, not because they're rare, but because you've finally slowed down enough to feel their weight. And you realize that presence is what makes everything holy. Your capacity for empathy deepens. You see beyond the surface. You stop judging people by what they show and begin understanding them by what they hide. You become a safe space for others, not because you have the answers, but because you offer presence without pressure. You listen not to respond, but to connect. You stop giving advice where compassion is needed. You stop speaking over silence. You learn to just be with people in their pain, to sit beside them in their sorrow, to walk with them in their waiting. That kind of empathy doesn't come from intellect, it comes from alignment, from knowing what it feels like to be seen by God even when you're at your worst, from understanding that love is not earned, it's extended. You become more discerning, not cynical, but clear. You start to sense when something is off, even if it looks right on paper. You trust your intuition. You honor your gut feelings. You stop dismissing that inner voice for the sake of being polite or liked. You know when to walk away. You know when to pause. You know when to say, "This doesn't serve me anymore." And that doesn't make you harsh, it makes you healthy. You stop staying in places that shrink you. You stop tolerating energies that drain you. You choose peace over people pleasing. And in that choosing, you reclaim your power. You stop performing. You stop pretending. You start showing up as your full, honest, imperfect self. You release the masks, the filters, the need to curate your life for public approval. You live with integrity even when no one is watching. You keep your promises. You own your mistakes. You say sorry without ego. You say thank you without entitlement. You become whole enough to stand alone and humble enough to serve others. That balance is rare, but it's real. And it's what happens when your heart beats in rhythm with God's. You develop spiritual patience. You no longer panic when things take longer than expected. You understand that growth takes time. That healing is not linear. That change happens in layers. So you stay the course, you show up, you do the work, even when results aren't visible, even when you feel unseen. You know that unseen doesn't mean unvalued. You know that the roots grow before the fruit shows. You know that God works in the dark just as much as in the light. So you remain faithful, not because it's easy, but because it's true. Because something in you knows that what you're building matters, even if no one claps for it yet. You start attracting different things, opportunities that align with your values, people who respect your boundaries, situations that honor your peace, not because life got easier, but because you raised your frequency. You stopped settling. You started choosing from a place of self-respect, and that changed everything. Your standards rise not from ego, but from clarity. You know what you bring to the table, you know your worth, and because of that, you no longer beg for crumbs when you were meant for abundance. You become less reactive. You don't let every comment steal your peace. You don't allow every delay to shake your faith. You respond with wisdom, not with impulse. You pause, you pray, you breathe. You've learned that not everything deserves your energy. Not every battle is yours to fight. Not every invitation needs a response. That restraint isn't weakness, it's power. The power to walk away, to stay grounded, to choose what's worth your spirit and what's not. You start honoring your body differently. You treat it like a vessel for purpose, not just a decoration. You move it with care. You feed it with intention. You rest it without guilt. You listen to its signals. You honor its limits. You no longer punish it for not looking a certain way. You thank it for carrying you this far. You treat your health as a form of worship, not vanity, because you realize your body is a gift, a sacred tool, not a trophy. You stop outsourcing your validation. You don't need constant praise to feel good about yourself. You don't rely on applause to affirm your path. You know who you are. You know who called you. That knowing becomes your anchor. You can receive criticism without crumbling. You can celebrate others without comparing. You can walk your own lane without needing a spotlight. Because your confidence isn't loud, it's rooted. Your dreams become more aligned with purpose than with prestige. You're no longer chasing things just because they look good. You're chasing what feels true. You start dreaming with God, not just for yourself. You invite Him into your plans. You let Him reshape your vision. And sometimes that means letting go of what you thought you wanted. Sometimes it means starting over. But because you trust Him, you obey. Even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when it's lonely. You know that obedience is never wasted. That every yes to Him leads you deeper into who you were always meant to be. Your prayers deepen. They're no longer just lists of requests. They become conversations, moments of intimacy. You talk to Him about everything, the small things, the hidden things, the raw things. You stop filtering your emotions in prayer. You stop pretending to be okay. You come as you are, broken, tired, joyful, confused, and you're met with love every time. That encounter changes you. It softens your heart. It strengthens your resolve. It reminds you that you're never truly alone, not even for a moment. You begin to live with eternity in mind. You stop living only for what's temporary. You think about legacy, about impact, about soul over image. You build things that last. Relationships that endure, work that matters. You're no longer trying to be the biggest, you're trying to be the most faithful. And in that faithfulness, you find freedom. Freedom from comparison, from striving, from ego. You know you're part of something bigger, something holy, something eternal. You don't realize how much noise you've been carrying inside until you finally hear the silence of your soul. And when you match God's frequency, that silence becomes sacred. It's not the absence of sound, it's the presence of peace. It's the stillness that lets you hear the whispers of divine guidance, the gentle nudges that say, this way, not that one. It's the clarity that flows when you stop begging for answers and start making space for wisdom. You begin to understand that not everything needs fixing. Some things need to be released. Some things need to be grieved. Some things simply need to be witnessed in love, and then let go. This frequency teaches you how to unclench your soul and just breathe. To trust that life isn't happening to you, it's happening for you. That the delays, detours, and even the heartbreaks were always part of a higher choreography. That only becomes visible in the rearview mirror of healing. Matching God's frequency doesn't make life perfect. It makes you peaceful within imperfection. You begin to hear life differently. The same bird songs you once ignored now sound like symphonies. The wind through the trees becomes a conversation. The quiet moments no longer feel empty, they feel full. Full of presence, full of connection, full of God. You stop waiting for the extraordinary and begin finding the divine in the ordinary. A sunrise becomes a sermon. A child's laughter becomes a blessing. A moment of eye contact becomes sacred ground. You begin to realize how much you used to miss when you were rushing. How many miracles were disguised as mundane moments. You start to slow down. Not because life demands it, but because your soul does. And in that slowness, something beautiful unfolds. Life stops being something you try to conquer and becomes something you get to experience, moment by moment, with God at your side. You begin to realize how little control you actually have and how much peace that gives you. You stop white-knuckling your dreams. You stop scripting every outcome. You stop wrestling with what you cannot change. Instead, you lean back into divine trust. You start saying, "I don't know how, but I trust you." You start breathing in uncertainty and exhaling faith. You let go of needing all the pieces. Before you move, you just move, knowing that if you're aligned with God's frequency, the path will make itself known. You stop being afraid of failure, because even failure becomes feedback. Even setbacks become spiritual preparation. Even waiting becomes sacred when you know who you're waiting with. That shift changes everything. Your timeline doesn't frustrate you anymore. You don't panic when things take longer than expected. You've matured into trust. You've learned to walk by faith, not sight. That's not just a quote, it becomes your daily rhythm. And in that rhythm, something powerful awakens inside. You, discernment. You begin to sense what feels aligned and what feels off. You notice energy before words. You pick up on frequencies before facts. You trust your spirit over your fears. When something isn't right for you, your soul speaks louder than your mind. That's not intuition, that's divine alignment. That's what happens when you clear out the noise, the ego, the chaos. You create a channel for clarity. You don't chase anymore. You attract. You don't beg for love. You embody it. You don't force connections. You honor who's meant for your frequency. And you let go of who isn't, not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. You bless people as they leave and make room for who's meant to stay. Your life becomes less about who's around you and more about who you're becoming. And who you're becoming is sacred. This frequency begins to shape the way you respond to pain. You stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What is this trying to teach me?" You stop running from discomfort and begin embracing it as part of your refinement. You understand that growth isn't always gentle, it's often messy, emotional, and uncomfortable. But now, instead of seeing pain as punishment, you see it as pruning. You know that God doesn't waste your wounds. Every tear you shed is seen. Every sleepless night is noted. Every ache in your heart is heard. And though the healing may not come quickly, it comes completely. You begin to trust that brokenness is not the end, it's the beginning of breakthrough. You no longer hide your scars. You honor them. You no longer resent your past. You redeem it. You don't need everything to be pretty, you need it to be purposeful. And when you're on God's frequency, everything has purpose. Even your voice changes, not just the way you speak, but the spirit behind your words. You speak with intention, with compassion, with weight. People begin to feel calm in your presence. You start becoming a safe space, not because you're perfect, but because you're present. Your energy becomes soothing. Your silence becomes healing. Your words begin to carry the echo of grace. And you realize that this world is desperate for people like that. People who are rooted in something deeper than trends, louder than opinions, stronger than fear. You become a lighthouse, not because you shine the brightest, but because you remain lit when others flicker. You hold steady. You become consistent. You radiate peace, not because life is easy, but because your spirit is anchored. You don't sway with every storm. You've built your house on the rock, and that quiet strength becomes your testimony. You start recognizing when you're slipping off that frequency. You feel it in your spirit, the tension, the restlessness, the need to control, the anxiety that creeps in when you start moving out of alignment. But now you know how to return. You know how to pause, to pray, to breathe, to reconnect. You know how to come back to the source. You've stopped trying to do life alone. You no longer separate the sacred from the ordinary. Every moment is spiritual now. Every choice is a vibration. Every interaction is an opportunity to either match God's love or disconnect from it. And while you'll still fall short, because we all do, you fall forward now. Forward into grace. Forward into mercy. Forward into transformation. And the final transformation isn't loud, it's quiet. It's not fireworks and fanfare. It's subtle, like a soft light breaking through clouds. It's not the world changing, it's you. You become deeply okay. Okay with your past, okay with your pace, okay with your place in this world. That doesn't mean you don't dream anymore. It means you dream differently, with surrender, with wisdom, with an open hand instead of a clenched fist. You stop trying to climb ladders and start building tables. You stop chasing platforms and start cultivating presence. You stop trying to be seen and start truly seeing others. That's what matching God's frequency does. It makes you more loving, more present, more human, more divine. And then it hits you. You didn't just tune into a new vibration. You became it. You became peace. You became patience. You became love. You became grace in motion. You became the evidence that God is still speaking, still healing, still transforming. Not through thunder or spectacle, but through quiet lives, lived in deep alignment. You are not perfect, but you are aligned. And in that alignment, miracles flow through you. Not for applause, not for attention, but because that's what happens when you match the frequency of heaven. This is what happens when you match God's frequency. You don't just find peace. You become peace. You don't just experience love. You embody love. You don't just walk through life. You light the way.